In this first video for lesson 3-6, we're going to ask ourselves, how do I compare, add, and subtract fractions and decimals with the same unit? Now we're going to skip around a little bit. I actually want us to start on workbook page 100. We're going to talk about how a fraction is set up. Many of you already know that a fraction has a numerator and a denominator. And the numerator is the number on the top, the denominator is the number on the bottom. But what do they represent? Well, the denominator of a fraction tells the number of equal parts that the whole is divided into, and therefore the number of unit fractions that are made. So take a look at this whole like orange colored bar here. You can see that that whole thing is broken up into 7 sections. Each one represents 1/7 of the whole. So this is 1/7, this is 1/7, this one's 1/7, and so on and so forth. So these are all unit fractions. You're talking about one of the total 7 units that make up this whole bar. If you look, they actually have some of the units set up so that you can do some addition here. We have 1/7 here, another 7th, and another 7th. So this whole thing represents 3/7. And over here we have 1/7 here, 1/7 here. Well, that whole section represents 2/7. So now it looks like an addition problem. We've got 3/7 plus 2 more 7ths, and now we have a total of 5/7. So we were actually able to do a little bit of addition there just by combining all of our 7ths. Notice the only thing that, was put together were the numerators. The denominator stayed the same. It was still adding 7ths. So we kept the 7 there. Take a look down here. This whole is broken up into tenths, but instead of writing 1/10 as a fraction, they broke it up as tenths in decimal form. So you can see this one right here is 1/10, then another 1/10, and another 1/10, and all together we have 3/10. And here's another 10th and another 10th. So this whole section here represents 2/10. And then when you add them all up, you have a total of 5/10. Okay? Now let's get back to workbook page 99. In workbook page 99, we're going to be comparing some fractions and some decimals. Now you may want to use the diagram at the top of the page to help understand why some of these numbers are greater or less than each other. But there's also some important rules that I'm going to share with you. The first rule here is that if the numerators are the same, the top numbers are the same, the fraction with the lesser denominator is actually going to be greater because its unit fractions are greater. So take a look at number 1. You obviously know that 4 is greater than 3. But now we're talking about 1/4 and 1/3. Let's see what happens if we were to set up a diagram. Here's one whole, and here's another whole. So we have 2 wholes here. In the first whole, I'm going to break it up into fourths. 1, 2, 3 fourths. I know it's not perfect, but you get the idea. The second one, we're going to break up into thirds. Okay? So they're both representing one whole. But the first one is broken up into fourths, the second one's broken up into thirds. Well, watch what happens when I shade in 1/4 and when I shade in 1/3. Which one is actually greater? If you look carefully enough, you will see that 1/3 is actually greater than 1/4, or 1/4 is less than 1/3. That's because of this rule here. The numerators were the same, right? They were both 1. We were talking about unit fractions. But we're talking about 1/4 compared to 1/3. The 1/3 has bigger sections, bigger unit fractions, and that's why it's greater. So whenever you have the same numerator, just compare the denominators. Take a look at number 2. We can apply that same idea here. This is 1/100th, and this is 1/10th. So if you were to compare them, 1/10th is actually going to be bigger. Imagine taking a whole and breaking it up into tenths, and then taking another whole and breaking it up into 100th or hundredths. That would be a lot of really tiny sections. So 1/10th is going to be a bigger section than 1/100th would be. Or if it helps, keep them as decimals. Line up your decimal point, just like that. Add some zeros on if you need to so that each decimal has the same number of decimal places, and then compare them. Which one's greater, 1/100th or 10/100ths? It's still 10/100ths that's greater, which, if you remember, was originally the 1/10th. And the last one here, 1,000 is greater than 100. Yeah, sure. But what about 1,000th compared to 1/100th? In this case, the 1/100th is bigger because you're going to have bigger sections. The unit fractions are bigger. Or again, line up your decimal places if it helps, if you want to leave them as a decimal. Remember to add zeros if you need to make sure that each number has the same number of digits, and then compare them. In this case, 10,000ths, which if you remember was originally 1/100th, is the same as 1,000th. Now, what if your numerators aren't the same? What if this time the denominators are the same? This time, if you have like denominators, the fraction with the greater numerator is going to be greater. So think of it this way, 3/4, here's my whole, here's another whole, and both of them are broken up into fourths. They're both broken up into the same unit fractions, but this one has 3/4, and this one only has 1/4. Obviously, 3/4 is greater than 1/4. Apply that idea to 3/8 and 7/8. I'd rather have 7 of those 8 sections than 3 of those 8 sections. So 3/8 is less than 7/8. 7/8 is the bigger one. Here we have 7/10 and we have 9/10. Obviously, 9/10 is going to be greater because, again, you're talking about 9 of those same sections compared to 7 of the other ones. Or again, line up your decimal point and you can obviously see, in this case, the 9 is greater than the 7. Alright, page 100. So now, to add or subtract fractions with like denominators, all you have to do is add or subtract the numerators. So now we're talking again about those like denominators. We had like denominators on the last screen when we were comparing them. Now we're going to be adding and subtracting them. So take a look at 3/9 plus 2/9. Well, if I have 3/9 and I add 2 more 9ths, I now am going to have 5/9. The only thing that changed was the numerator. The denominators stay the same. Take a look at the subtraction. Here we have 5/7 minus 3/7. That means I'm going to have only 2/7 left over. Again, the denominator stayed the same. The only thing that we added or subtracted was the numerators. Now, to add or subtract decimals with like places, add or subtract the numbers in the places. Line up your decimal points. That's so important. Make sure that the decimal points, one is on top of the other. And that way, that'll help that all of your other numbers are going to be lined up in the same place. We have zeros in the ones place, we have a 5 and a 3 in the tenths place, so everything's lined up nice and neat. And now all we need to do is subtract. 5 minus 3 gives me 2. Of course, 0 minus 0 is 0. And you bring your decimal point straight down, so that is going to give me 2/10. 5/10 minus 3/10 is going to give me 2/10. That's what it would look like as a fraction. Alright, we've got a lot of takeaways here. Move that out of the way. So remember, when you're comparing fractions, if you have the same numerator, All you have to do is compare the denominators. Just remember, the bigger the denominator, the smaller the fraction. However, if you have the same denominator, you can compare the numerators. And the bigger the numerator, the bigger the fraction. So, two different rules there. Comparing decimals. Remember, you can line up the decimal points. You can add zeros if you need to so that each number has the same number of digits. And finally, just compare your digits from left to right. And that we're going to do more practice with comparing decimals in some other lessons. Adding and subtracting fractions with like denominators. Just add or subtract the numerators. Numerators only. Keep the denominators the same. And also, make sure your answer is in simplest form. And finally, adding and subtracting decimals. Make sure you line up your decimal points. That's so important. You have to line up your decimal points when you're comparing decimals, and you have to line up your decimal points when you're adding and subtracting them. You can add zeros if needed so that each number has the same number of digits. And of course, add or subtract like you usually would, and bring your decimal point straight down into your answer.